Welcome everybody to the Dynamical Systems Reading Group / seminar. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Rainer Engelken, who's an, I wouldn't say old colleague, but colleague of long date. Rainer, together with Max, who's also a Mila member, together with us here, we're in Göttingen and the Max Planck Institute for Dynamics and Self-Organization back in the days where we were all looking at different angles of chaotic spiking networks and the dynamical systems tools to understand them. So that was very, very formative years for me, I think, and I hope for Max and Rainer. And then Rainer moved on to do a postdoc at Columbia University in the neural theory group, where he works along with Larry Abbott and a number of other people. And so Rainer has developed into like a very notable expertise in tools of dynamical systems, namely Lyapunov exponents and numerical and theoretical tools to estimate them. So I'm super pumped to have Rainer come and talk to us about the latest findings in this seminar. So Rainer, welcome to Mila. Next time it's going to be in person, yeah, looking forward to your talk.
Thanks so much for this kind introduction, Guillaume, and thanks so much for having me. So this is work which is really hot off the stove. So it's the very first time I talk about it in public. So please forgive me if things are not words are not super smooth out. The title is Input Correlations Impede Suppression of Chaos in Learning and Balanced Firing Rate Networks. So found an interesting link between suppression of chaos and trainability in balanced networks and how that depends on input correlations. This is work which originally started by Alessandro Ingrosso and Larry Abbott, and then Ramin joined, I joined, and now for the mean field theory part, Sven Göttingen joined. And yeah, I would really like to keep this as interactive as possible, so please don't hesitate, especially junior members, to interrupt with questions. Let's pretend that we are sitting in my seminar room, and I will slow you down if you ask too many questions for my taste. And so this talk consists of two parts. First part will be mostly results on the story, and then in the second part I have more a tutorial style introduction into our mean field theory calculations, and so depending on what your interest is, we can put more emphasis on the first part, which is maybe more instructive for people who've never heard of balanced states or for this particular phenomenon. But I think the second part about mean field theory that might be of much bigger interest also, just as a general introduction how to think of mean field theory. All right, without further ado, let's get started. So I guess we all agree that information in the brain is processed by the coordinated activity of large-scale neural circuits. Understanding mechanism, how this complex interactions gives rise to functions such as processing sensor information, performing decisions, or controlling behavior is a challenge both for experimentalists and theory. So in the following, I want to discuss under which conditions is such a complex dynamics being controlled by external input. And the model system which we will use for that is a recurrently connected network of firing rate units in continuous time. And similar questions have been asked before. So what regulates control of neural circuit activity? So you can think of it as some recurrent network state X, and we want to know what is the probability of X given I. And so if it's completely controlled, that would mean that's basically a delta distribution. So for the given input, you have no uncertainty about the recurrent network state X. But so if you have stochasticity or chaos in your system, there's not such a one-to-one mapping, and so we want to understand when is it controlled. And so three quick motivations. Firstly, that's important to drive a network with optogenetic input. So let's say there are all these new great tools where we can play piano on a cortex and activate, deactivate neurons with single cell and single spike precision. And then the question is, what external input is suitable to completely control a recurrent network state. But of course, that's also an important question for the brain itself. When you have a projection, let's say from LGN to the primary visual cortex, or from premotor areas into the motor cortex, the question is, when can such projection or the activity along such a projection control the target circuit and thus transfer information? So there's a tight link between controllability and transfer of information. And then as a third motivation, and that's actually how this started, when Alessandro tried to train vanilla balanced networks using force, he found that it's much more difficult to train them if you have correlated input. So it was really not clear why, and so here we have a theory for why that happens.
Right now, so, there is a notification on your screen that blocks.
Oh, that's so sad. Is it gone?
Yes, thanks.
Thanks for letting me know, Marta. And also thanks for setting this all up. Yeah, chaos in recurrent networks has been studied before, and also the role of external input. So one classical study by Molgeda and Schuster has studied in discrete time how external input can suppress chaos. So they used Gaussian white noise in a discrete time network that was later extended by Kanaka, Rajan, Khamsopolinsky, Lariabet, where they used sinusoidal input in a continuous time network, and they found a frequency-dependent suppression of chaos. And more recently, that was extended by Schücker, Gödecke, and Helias, who extended that to Ornstein-Uhlenberg and Gaussian white noise process in a continuous time neural network. To note that all of these previous studies always assumed that each unit in a recurrent network receives independent external input. So all of them receive independent input. I think that's also the scenario Guillaume studied in his PhD in spiking networks. But what we want to study today, and so what is new here, is I dropped this index I from the external input, so networks receive correlated input, or I'll go to the extreme of common input. That means each neuron receives the same input. Now you might think, well, that makes it easier somehow, but actually the opposite is the case, because if you make a mean field theory, you now have to take into account a time-dependent mean, a time-dependent variance, and an autocorrelation, which explicitly depends on 2 time points, because the whole system is non-stationary anymore. And so in the second part of the talk, I will run you through the steps how to get to this mean field theory. And in the first part, I will describe how if you have correlated input in a balanced network, how that drastically changes suppression of chaos and trainability. Any questions so far? Feel free to ask. All right, so the setup is clear. I'll first describe the story in pictures and then in graphs.
Sorry, I actually do have a question. If you don't mind.
Go for it.
So I guess that removing the I in the input is to make it correlated, but it's not the only way to make it correlated. So if you think about what Renard has done in the past, so you can have a shared input on also from the correlation, set up correlation in the input itself. So you could say, well, instead of having removing the sub I to the input, you can keep it and play with how much they are correlated.
Totally, yes. So we have actually the theory for interpolating from a totally independent to a totally common input. And for example, what Alfonso Renard studied in binary networks would be a scenario which you described, that you have some pre-synaptic population, and then you change how correlated the input in a target neuron is. And so here we just look on this talk, for the sake of simplicity, we just look on the 2 extremes, either completely independent or completely correlated, which I call common. All right, but I'd be happy to discuss more what happens in between.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you repeat what's the motivation behind trying correlated input? If you have for example, if you have a chaotic system and you have an input for every variable, I cannot foresee that it will solve any problem at all. So why do you do this?
Okay, so the first, so the neuroscientific motivation is, as I said, that actually in the brain there is a wiring probability between excitatory cells on the order of 10%. So neurons do receive a lot of correlated input, and then the question is, how does it shape the controllability? And second motivation is if you have these optogenetic experiments and you drive usually at least one way how they're currently being done is you drive, for example, a whole population of, let's say, all inhibitory cells of a certain subtype. You also now drive them all at the same time, so you induce correlations. And the third motivation was really, and that's how it started, that Alessandro and Grosso found that if you have a balanced network and you have and you train it using a target-based training scheme called full force, where you drive all neurons with the same target sequence, for example, a sine wave, then it's much harder to suppress chaos and make them trainable.
Yeah, it is harder to suppress chaos. Okay. All right, thanks.
So pictorially, what does it mean? Let's say we start with a bunch of initial conditions, and so without external input, they will now slowly settle into onto a chaotic attractor, which is usually a fractal object of non-integer dimensionality. Here I depict it by projecting it on the first three principal components. Now, if we drive it with weak external input, we get an interesting object, time-dependent chaotic attractor. So for briefly, for smooth initial distributions, all the initial distributions will converge to this time-dependent SRB measure. And I think Guillaume gave a talk 2 weeks ago, so I don't go into too much details of that. And now, in the case of strong input, when the external input is sufficiently strong to basically squeeze together different initial conditions, they go to a random sink, so a time-dependent set of measure zero. And so in this case, we would call the system state controllable by the external input. Now, to better understand this random dynamical systems, I think Guillaume mentioned that last week. The scenario is we fix some input realization, and we take different initial conditions and now observe how they evolve with respect to the same external input drive. And there are two theorems. Firstly, for white noise input, if the large Lyapunov exponent, which is a measure the local stability, so it's the exponential rate of divergence of nearby trajectories, that is negative, so, which means only locally trajectories are stable. Then also globally there is a convergence to a random sink guaranteed, so that to a set of measure zero. And so that was by Baxendale and Lian. And conversely, if the large Lyapunov exponent is positive, you get these time-dependent chaotic attractors, and Lysang Yang and Letopli have a theory for that. And as I mentioned, Guillaume Lajoie studied such a scenario also for spike networks. And yeah, actually, I also studied spike-driven chaotic networks in my PhD. But so here we look at firing rate networks. So that's the model we are considering. X can be thought of a current. Now the rate of change of that current is given by some lead term, some recurrent interaction term. So Jij is a coupling matrix drawn from a Gaussian with a negative mean. So the mean is minus J0 divided by square root n. And the variance is G squared divided by n. And so this scaling of the variance makes sure that the spectral radius is invariant of n. So this scaling of the mean coupling with J0 divided by square root n now makes sure that, so that's called a balanced scaling. So that means that all couplings are negative, and so they dynamically cancel strong external inputs, which are also of order square root n, such that the resulting variance is of order 1 if you crack up n. And so in spiking networks or in binary network, that leads very robustly to asynchronous irregular activity. And such a state can also be generated in these firing rate networks. So now, furthermore, we have some external input, I of t, which has some constant component and some time-dependent component. And so the nonlinearity we use for simplicity, ReLU, but what I present in the following, it works for generic nonlinearities. Any questions about this setup? So
Rainer, do you have inhibitory neurons, or is it just? I don't see a split between
no.
So inhibitory and excitatory.
Yeah, you could think of that as one population of inhibition-dominated neurons. Note that the coupling matrix is here drawn from a Gaussian, so strictly speaking, there is a small tail of positive couplings. And indeed, if you crank up G, this network actually blows up. And so there's a paper by Jonathan Kadmon and Zumpolinsky in PRX, I think 2015, where they developed a similar dynamic mean field theory as was developed earlier by Zumpolinsky Santi Summers for 10H networks. And you get very similar phenomenon. So if you crank up G, at some point there's a transition from a trivial fixed point where all units go are at rest towards a chaotic state. And as I just mentioned, if you further crank it up at some point, the whole network diverges and basically explodes.
So, but this network doesn't respect Gale's principle, right? Like any neuron can have both positive and negative outgoing weights?
In principle, if you choose J0 sufficiently negative, then you can really neglect this positive tail. So in this case, you could just think of it as one inhibitory population which has heterogeneous couplings. So I would say it's the most minimal scenario of a balanced state. So to have a balanced state, basically you need to have very strong recurrent inhibition, net inhibition, such that an external input is dynamically being cancelled. But this could easily be now extended to a multi-population network where, then you just have way more parameters to think about and to play around with. So this is in principle like the simplest balanced firing rate network you can think of.
Just the question whether if you proceed to networks of conductance space integrated fire neurons of excitatory and inhibitory populations, if the formalism still is a good description of the dynamics?
So balanced networks has also been studied in spiking networks and also in conductance space networks. So here we are really doing a mean field theory for spiking networks works a little bit differently. One way how you can map firing rate networks to spiking networks would be to have spiking networks with slow synapses. So if there's a separation of timescale between membrane timescale and synaptic timescale, then your currents basically act as continuous variables. So
I'm familiar with the work of balanced and excitatory inhibitory neurons. Generally, you can use a Wilson and Cohen-like approach, but there generally the stability is defined by looking at the fixed point and looking at it. There's depending on the you can have different coupling strengths between excitatory and inhibitory populations, and based on those relationships, you can get either a positive or negative eigenvalue in the phase plane, and that determines that's the criteria used to determine the stability. So we don't get to plug it right into the connectivity matrix, but it's something that is reflected in the average connection probabilities of between the two subpopulations.
I'll come to the mean field description at the end. So if you don't mind, I would like to defer that question to the end or to the second part of the talk. Briefly speaking, it's not only the connection matrix which determines the dynamics in a mean field picture and the stability, but also the nonlinearities and also the external input. But it's a really important question, and I think I'll come to that later. And as I mentioned, so that was first developed by Kadmon, Zumpolinsky, and Harish Hansel made that link to spiking networks. And yeah, there's also work by Francesca Mastro Giuseppe and Cezeno Stoic, which use the similar kind of
add a little thing here, Rainer.
In a fixed point region. Yeah.
Yeah, just following Alif's question. So I remember the first time I saw inhibitory networks only as a good zeroth order sort of balanced state network model. I was a bit puzzled, but in the context of spiking networks, I think if you go back to say the Monteforte paper, the idea is that if each neuron is inhibitory but is in a sort of like firing state, like network firing state, like tonic firing state, then the rationale is that they receive enough inputs, excitatory inputs that are kind of folded into the intrinsic dynamics such that the interactions in between them are the things that matter, and inhibition is enough to model the balanced state. And I guess here, Rainer, correct me if I'm wrong, is because you have rate networks, you assume that there's always some sort of non-zero activity that's happening here, right? So,
not really. Thanks for asking again. Like, what makes this inhibition-dominated network balance? I think there is a general misconception of what balance means. So when I talk about balance, I talk about this framework by Frieswijk-Sopolinsky, where you have large excitatory inputs, which is dynamically cancelled recurrently by net inhibitory recurrent couplings. And so the recurrent coupling matrix really has to be net inhibitory. And of course, now we can extend this model to a two-population network with both excitation and inhibition, but qualitatively, this picture doesn't really change. Actually, this two-population extension is also done in this Kaplan-Sopolinsky there, but the balance really comes here from the cancellation of external current by recurrent currents, and not by a balance between excitation and inhibition within the network. I think that's thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah.
If I could just mention, I think one distinction, for instance, is that for sort of fixed external constant drive, you're not going to get the correlation, the dynamic correlation between the two, because you just have a constant input, which is sort of counter to people's idea of this tracking of E and I. So there's that distinction, maybe.
Yeah. So once you have time-dependent input, then you really see this tracking. But with constant input, you could say a balanced network is tracking its own mean population fluctuation. Okay, and so if we just simulate that, what we get is we have here this external input, and here is the recurrent currents for 3 example neurons, and you see that these are anti-correlated. So if there's in this case, it's an Ornstein-Willenbeck process which is driving the whole network, and all the units receive correlated input, and so they now cancel that external input. And so that's what that makes this balance. Basically, you have large fluctuations, large excitatory currents, large recurrent inhibitory currents, and they are canceling each other and result in something of order 1. And so now if you crank up your synaptic strength, or your at the same time, or your number of synapses, you go towards this balance equation. So the mean firing rate is given just it's basically acting like a operational amplifier for the engineers among you, and the firing rate is given as a linear function between the mean external input and the mean coupling strength. So as you basically go deeper in the balanced regime, so in this case, if we crank up n, this is getting more and more precise. And so I have here a little mod variable k, which is basically just increasing at the same time J0, and at the same time also increasing IA bar. And by increasing k, I can now mimic this behavior of increasing the number of synapses in a sparse network. And you can see that both for common and independent input, for large k, this balance equation is getting chosen. Okay, and so now what this is all about is really this huge difference between common and independent input. You might assume, well, if a network is driven by correlated input, so each unit receives the same input, that's somehow better in enslaving the network state, or in like controlling each and every unit, because they are somehow synchronizing by the external input. But exactly the opposite is the case. If you have common input, this common external input through this balance mechanism is basically cancelled, and the common component is cancelled, and you have a large recurrent component which is counteracting with that, and only fluctuation of order 1 over square root n is remaining, which is then driving the network. While in an independent input, there is not such a tracking, and therefore no such cancellation can occur, and therefore you need way weaker external input to suppress chaos. So that's the pictorial description, but I'll go into the theory right away. So the easiest way to understand that in our framework is actually in the adiabatic scenario. So by adiabatic, I mean very slow external input and very small coupling strength. So in that case, basically the input is changing so slow that we can assume it to be stationary at each point, and then the only way to suppress chaos in a ReLU network is to make the external input negative. And so once the network is negative, all the units go back to are basically contracting with a membrane time constant, because they don't, with a characteristic time scale, because they don't receive any external input. And so in between, in these episodes here, the network is chaotic. And so whenever these very stable episodes are being compensated by these weakly chaotic episodes where the network receives positive input, that would be when chaos is being suppressed. And so from this criterion, basically, that in these stable episodes, the chaos, the average Lyapunov exponent here has to compensate this Lyapunov exponent, the very small positive Lyapunov exponents in these chaotic episodes. You can get an adiabatic limit for this critical input strength, and so for small g and for small f, that works rather well. So just to again explain what you see here in the picture, that's the huge recurrent input, and that's just all the time being tracked by the recurrent input. And of course, your currents cannot become the ReLU cannot become negative, so the firing rates are not negative, and therefore the recurrent currents here cannot become positive in this depiction. So this was just a zero order description for small g and for small f, and now further in the talk I will explain the full picture. But here you can already see that basically this external input is out of order square root n, so that means if you want to hit 0, you need to have a modulation strength of order square root n. And indeed, if we look at the scaling of the critical input strength with network size, so in green you see the common input case, in lilac you see the independent input case, see that this scales with square root n in the independent input case. So this is now across, I guess, 50 network realizations, and you see with the dotted lines, you see the interquartile range, and the dashed line is the mean field theory, to which I will come later. And so in huge contrast to that, in the independent input case, if you crank up n enough, there is literally no n dependence anymore. That means you go to very large networks, there's now a huge difference between suppression of chaos for independent and for common input. Is this here? So that's basically the zero order effect.
Rainer,
no question.
What's the intuition of if I start to erode at the correlation, or just interpolate between these two lines? Have you looked at regimes where you have, not perfectly correlated inputs?
yeah, what happens is as soon as you have a little bit of uncorrelated input, you start to suppress chaos with a way smaller input. And so the reason is that basically this balance mechanism can only take care of any common component. So as soon as there is an independent component, an order one independent component is enough to suppress chaos.
So, I don't know, maybe that might be a bit contrivant example, but say I have just two-dimensional input. Half my neurons receive I1, half my neurons receive I2. I1 and I2 are completely independent. Would that be exactly the same as having equal, like, I don't know what the measurement here, but equally unperfectly correlated private inputs? Like, how do I think about
it? Would be the same, but I think it would make a huge difference.
Okay.
I think it's a great scenario. I should study that. What I've done so far is only really like especially extrapolated. But yeah, going to two populations, I haven't done that. Great idea. I'll do it, and I'll report back.
Yeah.
Also, when you said the input converged to the mean field one for very large networks, like how large you meant?
You're asking how large the network has to be in order to
you said
mean field to work?
Yes. I mean, what is the reason that you believe it will be the same in, for example, 10 to the power of 6 or something like that?
So now you're asking for the independent input, why it's not independent?
I'm asking what is the reason that you believe that it is going to be the same for very large networks?
Oh, no, I'm not saying it's the same. I say there's a square root n difference between common and independent input. Maybe it wasn't clear. I'm saying there's a huge difference between common and independent input, and that grows with square root n as a function of network size, so it's not going to be the same. What is?
I think this might be a more basic question of just in these sort of simple networks, the extrapolation to larger network sizes beyond your simulations. Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the mean field theory assumes Gaussian distributions, and so basically you have to go to larger and larger to make it more accurate. You have to go to larger and larger networks. So here you see the different network realizations, and some of them have a smaller critical input strength, and others have a larger one. And only if you go to very large networks that you can really predict this critical input strength very well with mean field theory. I will come to. I have another another figure about the convergence to the mean field theory later, and that might help.
Sorry, Rainer.
Yes, go ahead.
Would you explain how can you measure that you have suppressed the chaos? Because the main point here, how strong should be the input to suppress chaos, right?
Yeah, I do that in two different ways. Thanks so much for asking. The first way is I numerically calculate the largest Lyapunov exponent, and then I do a bisectioning on this input strength and find the right input modulation strength. In the case here, it's a sinusoidal input, such that the largest Lyapunov exponent is 0. So I do a bisectioning, basically a root finding. That's numerically. And the second case is this mean field theory approach, which I will talk about in the second half.
Okay, great. Thank you.
But thanks for asking. All right. So how does it scale with other parameters? So I already described for this very low frequency limit, you can see here that this small f and small g limit is quite accurate. So that's now for for g equals 2. So the critical coupling strength for 10H networks is at square root 2. So it's already above it, but still works pretty well. But now for larger frequency, we see a couple of interesting effects. The first effect is it's not actually perfect here, even for low frequencies, and that's because G is finite. And then the second effect is we find here a dip. So where does the dip come from? Well, if you have external input, subsequent network states are getting uncorrelated by the external input, and therefore, if you look on the Jacobians, subsequent Jacobians are getting uncorrelated. And so to decide whether a network is chaotic or not, what matters is the product of Jacobians, which basically tell how a small perturbation evolves from one network state to the next. And so the external input is decorrelating these subsequent Jacobians if the frequency is on the same time scale as the characteristic time scale of your recurrent network, so on the order of tau, and therefore you find a dip here. And that also explains why for independent input you have here a sweet spot where you basically just need weak external input or weaker external input to suppress chaos. And so what happens then for very high frequencies is that the single unit low pass filtering kicks in. So basically the single units have that leak term, and that acts as a low pass filter. So that means if you drive it with super high frequencies, they are just being smoothed out by the intrinsic filtering of the single units. And so that slope is 1. So for very high frequency.
Yeah. So I'm used to think of, the time scale of the network depending on the time scale of single neurons, but in this particular case, you have ReLU rate neurons. So what determines the time scale of the network, right?
So if you look back on the equation, I didn't write it down here, but implicitly there's a tau in front of
so you have a tau there. Okay.
So if you have a tau, I think, thanks for pointing that out. If I make this figure in terms of hertz, I should say my tau is 10 milliseconds. So therefore,
right. Okay, so it is the same time constant as the individual neurons.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thanks for pointing that out. And I should probably say, so here you see the full lines, that's theory, and the dots are numerics, and they're pretty good on top of each other. So we have as I describe in a bit, we can explain that using mean field theory. And so now, as a last point, so what happens as a function of coupling strength, so now we see for this small f limit, that's really pretty much off. And so the reason for that is, first I should say, in principle, if we have both small g and really small frequency, then that's another limit. Like going to this critical coupling strength is another limit where we can make the difference between common and independent input arbitrarily large. So from this adiabatic theory, I hope I have convinced you that for small f and for small g, the critical input strength modulation is basically I0, so the DC input, because you need to really make the network, the input current negative to suppress chaos, while if you're just at the edge of chaos, then already very weak independent input is sufficient for suppressing chaos, and at the limit, it's that would go to basically 0. So extremely small input is already enough. So again, this makes a difference between the two scenarios, which goes arbitrarily large. But so what we see here is a little bit different. So this small f limit doesn't work anymore, and so the reason, but generally the mean field theory, as you can see, the dots are still on the line, so the mean field theory still works. And so what is happening here? The reason this steps down here is just exactly the same reason as this steps down below this adiabatic limit. So here the frequency is 0.2 hertz, and so that is already sufficiently, although it is looking on this axis, it's still small, that is still sufficiently fast such that if you have very small g, so you have critical slowing down in your network and your autocorrelations are getting broader and broader, then it's enough to suppress chaos. So the point I want to make here is in order to make this small f limit work, you have to choose your limit the right way. Basically, first send f to 0 and then send g to the critical value. But so that's another a way of showing that the zero-order approximation is not the whole picture, but to get the whole picture, we need this independent mean field theory. And just very briefly, while the figures I showed you before were for sinusoidal input, the general mechanism that independent input behaves very different or has very different suppression of chaos than common input is also true for Gaussian white noise or for on-chain Wilbeck process input. So in this case, we now choose the external input to be from a Gaussian on-chain Wilbeck process. So we have some noise strength sigma here and some time scale s, and now over you can see that there's a huge difference between common and independent input in the critical input strength also here. And so now, what is the link to learning? Well, if you want to train a network, at least in a target-based approach, to deterministically do an input-output task, then if you start training, basically you don't want your teacher to be in a chaotic state. So in that scenario, you feed the target signal into the network, and if this target signal is not strong enough to suppress chaos, you won't be able to learn. And so that's a figure done by Alessandro Ingrosso. He had a network train and a very simple superposition on sine wave task. And you can see that when the Lyapunov exponent turns 0, that's approximately where the test error becomes 0. And so the scenario, just briefly, for those who are not familiar with full force, you have one teacher network, which now receives the superposition of sine waves, and you have some student network, which tries to imitate the teacher, and you learn the student weights by recursive least squares, and then you train the readout also by recursive least squares to reproduce, well, the student just tries to replicate the teacher, but then the recursive least squares tries to generate the correct output sequence. And indeed, the more heterogeneous your input, so here is on this axis is heterogeneity, basically meaning how different the inputs to the different units here, the larger, the more heterogeneous, the smaller is your error. And so on G, on this axis, you see the G, like the recurrent coupling strength of your teacher. And so I think now I'll come to the second part of the talk, which is generally the idea